Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. This time I'm delighted to welcome on the show one of Britain's leading political pollsters, Damian Lyons Lowe from Survation. I know polling information very often comes up in both what I write, and I know a lot of listeners have been very interested in previous shows where we've discussed polling. So really looking forward to delving into political polling with you, Damian. Welcome to the show.
Very pleased to be here. Thanks.
Now, what got you into political polling in the first place? Because it's quite those of us who are interested in it can get quite obsessed about it, but it is obviously a little bit of a niche. So what got you into it originally?
So I've always been into politics. So just as something that I was interested in, I had a job in research relating to investment banking, worked for investment banks. I worked in research, and as a hobby, I was doing things like trying to predict the results of reality TV shows.
Excellent.
By building opinion panels that had similar demographics to the watchers of those shows in order to predict who was going to win the program. So things like the X Factor or Big Brother. So really kind of difficult election types of things. So if you take the Big Brother example, every week there'd be an eviction, which was like an election. At the end of the week, it would be vote for your favorite or vote for the person you want to be evicted. So it could be either of those two methods. Yeah, the rules might change midweek. You'd need to redesign your question format. It was, very difficult because you didn't know exactly what the demographics of the voters were. So you had to try and work out a way to work that out. So that was a sort of a hobby that I had. And so I was publishing there's a blog that was predicting these types of elections, these public votes. And then around about 2010, thought, well, could this hobby, which had then included the 2010 general election, I think, could this hobby be a business? If you're really interested in this, could it be something that you're more interested in doing than working in research and investment banking? And the answer was yes. So that's how Survation was born.
It is. I wonder if it's a coincidence or a trend that I was just listening to a podcast the other day from a couple of people who run a really successful YouTube channel where you can watch them doing Sudoku puzzles, which may sound a rather weird thing to watch on YouTube, but it is surprisingly mesmerizing hearing them talk through how they're beating the best of Sudoku puzzle setters. But at least one of them, and possibly both of them, also used to be investment bankers and then decided to switch to something else. So I don't know what it is about investment banking that drives people to niche activities that involve numbers but not banks.
Yeah, so I guess I was a hobbyist pollster, and I always was interested in politics. There aren't always elections to test things out in, but if there are other things, like if you wanted to predict who was going to win BBC Sports Personality of the Year, how do you do that? It's not just a case of, for example, if you take that as an example, Sports Personality of the Year, it's not just a case of asking the general public who they think should win Sports Personality of the Year, because not all the public are watching, not all the public will vote. So you've got a turnout question, you've got a demographic question as to what does the voter model look like. It's the sort of thing it's the sort of skills that you need for political polling. And there was just so much material, things that you could try to predict and think about getting things right and wrong.
And I guess, I don't know if this applied to yourself, but I guess one of the attractions must be that a lot of those contests are ones that there are betting markets around. So if you are able to refine a little bit of a polling model, there must be it does make me wonder how many people there are around the country, therefore, who are quietly as a hobby maybe slipping questions into omnibus polls from polling companies to be able to fine-tune their betting.
Yeah, I think sadly most of these things have gone away, because there was a series of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, where the voter model was showing that David Guest was going to do very well, and the ITV managed to lose all his text votes, and he was booted out of the jungle very early. The inquiry into that meant that there was no more texting ever on voting shows on ITV, and they just sort of became something that was, just seen as not very fair on the viewers, and so the X Factor has been dropped, and that there aren't that many sort of live voting shows left
what
anymore.
A shame.
So
So
Yeah.
you've driven to political polling as a result. And I guess I know the answer to this, but for listeners who are less familiar with your work, what's been your best moment as a political pollster since you took that up seriously?
Yeah, so for other people, the best moment is the 2017 general election, where there's a sort of tired Damian on the BBC being interviewed by Andrew Neil, and the combination of me kind of stumbling with my words, I've got a mild stutter, and I was very, very tired. They're all having a good old laugh at the pollster that's predicting a hung parliament. They just think the whole thing is hilarious. He's just done a segment about bookies and bookies predicting elections with Matthew Sheddick at Ladbrokes, and it was all kind of a jokey thing. So they're having a bit of a laugh on the program, and then they brought on the pollster. Isn't this funny? It's the pollster. This one's the outlier pollster. Let's have a laugh at him. They brought in Deborah Mattinson to sit next to me to have the counter view to say that the hung parliament prediction was an outlier, and then to sort of have a bit of a chuckle at my prediction, which was probably going to be wrong because everybody else was not predicting that. So wouldn't that be a fun item? And then they could get them back afterwards. And either way, it would be funny, right? Because if I was right, that would be hilarious, and if I was wrong, that would also be pretty funny. But it would be, the joke would have been at my expense. That's probably what other people's best moments about me, but I don't have any fond memories of that at all, because the whole thing was just really, really unpleasant. And I wrote a chapter in one of the books about the election, about just how unpleasant it is to be the outlier in a general election, and how it's just for so many ways it's not a very happy place to be, and that it's so unpleasant being potentially the only person that's wrong in an election, or the most wrong, that through natural means, and so either by fiddling around, so herding, or by it just affecting your subconscious and changing the way that your critical thinking works, it can have an effect of making the predictions for elections more inaccurate, because in statistics you need things that fall outside the if every pollster makes a prediction in an election, so some of those predictions should be pretty outside the
yeah, because it's quite it's a really difficult judgment, isn't it? If you come up with an answer to something, even if it's a qualitative thing, if a group of people are discussing a topic around a table, if you got an answer or a point of view that is significantly different from everyone else, it's a very fine line between this is brilliant, I'm the genius, I've spotted something everyone else has missed, versus I'm an idiot if everyone else is saying something else, don't be so up yourself, you must be wrong. And being able to, in hindsight, it's easy to spot which of the two was the situation, but before the event, before the revelation, it's really hard, isn't it?
That's my biggest worry about polling in general, is that there's often an absence of critical thinking. People who are shouting the loudest are sometimes perceived to be the people that have got things right in the moment. There are lots of people in the polling industry that I really respect that you don't really hear from very much. You tend to hear from people who really like to tweet and to use social media a lot. It's difficult for people to contextualize who they are. They might not have done many elections before. They might be really good academic. Political academics often aren't very good at understanding about doing data collection. It's difficult for the public and the media to contextualize who is the person opining about polling and what's right and what's wrong, and how to understand what they've got to say in the context of other people.
I guess a good example of that would be somebody like maybe Martin Boone. That he's been one of the most innovative British pollsters over the last few decades in terms of particularly the stuff to deal with shy Tories in the aftermath of the 1992 election. And he's quite a self-effacing person. Whenever I've heard him speak at things like political science events, he's quite often quite self-critical, but really smart.
He's too self-critical. Yeah. I mean, he's almost self-destructingly self-critical. He's overly hard on himself.
I mean, he is on Twitter and he uses it a little bit, but he's not, as you say, the sort of person who is appearing at the top of your algorithmic news feed every other day. But definitely he's the sort of person where if he's written something, it's something that's much more worth reading than yeah, some of the things that bubble up to the top of Twitter. But that is maybe as much a feature of Twitter as it is of polling.
Yeah, quite possibly. But I think, so if you, there's a sort of the Britain elects phenomenon as well, where Britain elects has a huge following, and it doesn't really say whether it thinks that things are good or bad in a way that, say, Nate Silver tries to do, which we could discuss, but I mean, we don't necessarily need to. He has a very complicated grading system for pollsters, and he tries to, every time that he announces a poll result, you can look to see what his rating of that pollster is. Britain Lex doesn't really do that, so it's quite easy to be a not very experienced pollster and be putting out your figures, being Britain elected, and people just reading that, and that just sort of, so it's not even coming from the pollster in that situation. So a lot of things that people are seeing are just a set of numbers, perhaps a pollster name and Britain elects. And then I think that it's one step removal away from any kind of deeper understanding about what that poll means.
Yeah, I think the thing that Britain elects, and also other Twitter accounts like Election Maps UK, and I feel I need to mention both of them because there seems to be a little bit of some sort of falling out between them at some point in the past that I don't understand. So I'm not wanting to get caught in one camp or the other. But the things like the good thing I think that Twitter accounts like those achieve is that it's a lot easier to therefore follow all of the polls that are out there. And so if you're following one or both of those accounts, you will see a much wider range of poll results than you would otherwise, because I think the risk otherwise is you just end up seeing the poll that's the outlier, because that's the one that then gets the most attention and gets the media mentions. And for all that journalists know that there are such things as outlier polls, and after a election or a journalism conference talk about the problems of only reporting outliers, the moment an outlier lands in their email inbox, they nonetheless can't help themselves rushing to report it. So I think there are definitely good things about that, but as you say, it strips a lot of context away, in a way that I'm always struck by the comparison with football results. So I'm not a huge fan of football. I occasionally pay attention, like if the England team is doing particularly well, but it's very normal with football results to see the last 5 results for a team as part of the coverage. You see the lines of WL and Ds next to the team name. That sense of giving a bit of context to a result or what a team's form is really normal in the way that with polling. And I guess this is maybe a criticism, perhaps, or suggestion that could be made about pollsters. It's not only that the media or people like Britain Elects don't add in that context. It's similarly when Survation or anyone else issues a new poll, you almost always will give the change figures based on your last poll, but not that much context beyond that. And so I wonder, there's an interesting question that Diamard DCJ, I hope I pronounced that right, asked on Twitter ahead of us recording this about what pollsters could do beyond the basic industry sort of self-regulation, transparency requirements to help people better understand polling results. And I wonder if there's something about providing greater context to their results.
I think providing some perspective in normal language. I mean, you can write lots of technical requirements that. So the BBC's discussed this. How can we better portray polls so in terms of things like accuracy, we have a ruling that talks about the historical, so a statement that we can make that is about the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of polls. So rather than talking about sort of theoretical margin of error as being how accurate a poll is, we say, well, look, historically, political polls have been within these parameters, and that's how you should think about opinion polls. You can have a wider inaccuracy than a margin of error. But I mean, I don't think that's not really helping too much. I think just if someone with experience at the polling company says something that is important for context during the poll's publication, that's probably about the most that you could do. So someone like Kieran Pedley at Ipsos will quite quickly say something contextually about a poll release, and that can be helpful. It's very difficult to say what other rules there could be that could help.
And presumably one of the things that holds back pollsters a little bit from doing that is most of your polls are paid for by media outlets, and in a way you wouldn't want, say, the Survation Twitter account to essentially be rivaling the coverage for your client who's paid for the poll, so that there's definitely a role as being a sort of a backup source of information in a way, but you don't want the most interesting information to be on your Twitter account because it's the client who's paid for the poll who's
there's always that problem. I think people on Twitter feel like the Polestar owes them a bunch of stuff, whereas we're just providing some transparency mainly in relation to a release that belongs to the client, and it's their narrative that they are pursuing. I mean, we're fortunate enough that we don't get pushed around by our media clients as maybe we might have felt like we were 10 years ago. We don't need to work with anybody. We don't feel like we need to help them chase a story that can't be stood up by the figures. So it's not like we're disagreeing with a narrative. Yeah, I mean, what's an example of? I mean, what are we getting at with this question? What's an example of a situation that where things go wrong, would you say?
The main problem with context, I think, is that the way polls are reported is often with an up or down on the last comparable poll from that pollster, say +1, -2, whatever. And most of those changes are noise rather than signal, to sort of borrow Nate Silver's book title. As opposed to if you had, let's say, the latest poll figure come out, but what Kieran Ipsos Mori does, partly because quite a lot of the polling that he's tweeting about isn't paid for by a media client, actually. He's quite often doing Twitter threads about the non-Evening Standard polling Ipsos Mori. He's always immediately providing graphs that put that latest number, not just in the context of change from last time, but the last 6 months or the last year. And I think that makes it easier to see where, well, this just looks like it's similar to the noise that we've had before, or whether it's, this really is either a rogue poll or it's the start of a trend.
Yeah, so I've been encouraging the team to include a time series on voting intention as standard. Also, if you're talking about government approval or best prime minister, or how is the politician, to what extent are they doing a good job as in their role as X? I've been encouraging to use time series more because that helps a lot. And you can see time series are very interesting because you can see a lot of variation in things like approval. There's a lot of up and down. So the extent to which that's important or not, So you using it. So a simple answer might be yes. Using a more long-term time series to contextualize things would be helpful. Saying things like, this is the lowest ever approval rating for such and such, right? That sounds really exciting, but when you look at what that actually means, it doesn't mean an awful lot sometimes.
Yeah, and obviously the other problem is that often the meaning comes from comparing different pollsters, and that basic economic model of British political polling, where it's a media outlet is commissioning a poll. For all that we would love journalists to report stories as well as possible, we also have to recognise that if a media outlet has paid for a poll, it's unlikely to then run a story that says, actually, you know what, this isn't really telling anything interesting, or, you know what, this is at kilter with several polls that media rivals have recently commissioned, so you probably should pay more attention to them than to our poll. That's just it's not the natural dynamic of the business model that underpins political polling, is it?
No, I mean, I think that things have improved somewhat. I mean, if you take, for example, the last Scottish elections, we work with lots of different media clients. Let's take one issue. So take the issue of Alba, right? So Alba pops up during the campaign. It's become very politically important to work out whether Alba's going to get any seats at Holyrood. We were never asked for anything else apart from our expertise in working that out. And so we made the decision to really kind of play a straight bat with Alba, to sort of not use any kind of run-ins with words to say, Alba's now standing, how might you vote with your second vote at Holyrood, or sort of unduly prompting them. So we thought that, well, typically if we think that someone's going to get difficult call, more or less than 5%, you may or may not want to include them in a voting intention prompt. Anyway, regardless, the Scottish newspapers that we worked for allowed us to just do what we thought was best, and it said that Alba wouldn't get any seats because of the way that we had done that. There were some other polling in that example that did things slightly differently, that showed Alba achieving some seats at the time using slightly different prompting, but we were essentially sort of left to not drive a story one way or the other, and that was good.
That's certainly reassuring.
Yeah.
I guess in all of this, there's an assumption that the detail of the polls matters, down to the level of what's the few percentage point one way or another, that it might make a difference depending on how you word the question and whether you prompt with a party name or not. But we are thinking about Westminster elections, possibly several years away from a general election. I guess it's possible there will be a botched cabinet reshuffle and Boris Johnson ousted maybe this year, but one should perhaps put a fairly low, but maybe not zero probability on that. So most likely we're something like a couple of years away from a general election. Do you think what the polls are saying at the moment really matters? Is it something that people like me just get too obsessed about and pay too much attention to?
Well, not really, because it seems like politicians and political parties are all obsessing about any kind of data source that says, what may be happening at the next election, which is so important relative to all their jobs and their lives. They do obsess about it, and it creeps out into their behaviour, that the way that they set policy. If a party's doing badly in the polls, it tends to affect the way that they talk about themselves internally. I mean, when we have a jolly poll for Labour, fads and activists will come in and say, do you really believe these figures? Because it's really sort of, it's a big cheer up for them internally. They are all looking at political polls, so they have become important. If they didn't exist, the party will be using some of their own internal polls, which they all have. And it's quite interesting that the Labour Party's now got a sort of pollster. We mentioned Deborah Mattinson earlier. She is known for running focus groups particularly, but her role as the strategic role that she has within Labour, where that hasn't been a kind of a technical polling person before, is really interesting. So in the sense that if we listen better and understand the public more, then that's the secret to winning. Certainly the Conservative Party, they are doing lots of polling all the time. They're polling constituencies by telephone. They're doing lots and lots of focus groups as well, huge amounts of focus group work. So I think there's a lot of internal usage of polling, and I think that everything has a lot of meaning within this sort of angsty bubble that we're living in.
At least the advantage of polling is that it is capturing the views of the public, that the way into some of those internal political discussions, the way the public can influence them in many ways, is via what they tell opinion pollsters, because that has an influence on small meetings between senior politicians in a way that otherwise it can be very hard to exercise some influence over.
Yeah, I suppose my number one bugbear about polling at the moment is that there's a national debate about what our policy should be relating to COVID, for example, and the public could look at a poll from a pollster. So YouGov's probably the most active pollster in relation to government policies on COVID and what they should be. If you say in a poll something like the governments believe that this policy will be helpful because of this reason, do you support or if that's the kind of the general sense of the question, do you support or oppose this policy which might help keep us a bit safer? Right, essentially, you're getting huge support for almost anything. I mean, you could probably say ridiculous things, and people would support them. Now, if the public are really worried about COVID and also hugely supportive of public health and the NHS, I want to suggest that polling public opinion on these things isn't a very good way to decide what the policy should be from a public opinion standpoint, because it feels like people will generally want to agree with or support almost anything. I think you've seen some really weird polls from Ipsos Mori and for YouGov about sort of things that people would like to ban in the public interest or not have.
Yeah, or like banning nightclubs.
Yeah, just not having nightclubs. One was sort of, it might have been written poorly, but it seemed to be supporting a generalized ongoing curfew in the interest of public health.
Well, I suspect what part of what that captured was the way in which people treat opinion polls not as a specific legalistic exam question. So my favorite example of this was a poll ahead of the 2016 US presidential election, where supposedly a third of young Americans would rather a huge meteor crashed into the earth, killing millions, than have either Clinton or Trump as president. Reputable pollster, proper sampling, proper weighting, all of that. And I'm pretty confident that the issue wasn't how the poll was done. The issue and also that the answer isn't that there were loads of Americans who really were happy to contemplate the death of millions, but actually it's people treating it almost like an expressive bit of fun of, well, look, if I really don't like either Clinton or Trump, yeah, of course, that's the answer the pollster's giving me. And I think, like, are you in favor of a permanent 10 p.m. curfew or not? There are lots of reasons why you might say yes without necessarily actually thinking, if I was sat in Parliament and there was one vote in it and it was my vote, I would vote for this.
Yeah. So we've also got this sort of very, very. So the other part of your question is, it's a long time out. What difference do political polls make? And I said, well, the parties that they're always watching these things. I think we're really into the unknown in terms of a government and a pandemic. We really don't have any precedent for what future might be for political public opinion when there isn't a pandemic, or maybe there always is a bit of a pandemic. Maybe we never really manage COVID. It's always bubbling around the background, and maybe that's. But I would contend that hopefully COVID policy will become less and less important as it relates to political vote. So as the sort of COVID and pandemic related link becomes less strong in relation to political attitudes, how will people behave then? We really don't know. We have no precedent for this, right? I always think about the Second World War. I think, well, we had this wartime government and people accepted Churchill leading the national government because it was a crisis. But once we'd seen the back of the Second World War, they wanted a left agenda. They wanted lots of home building. They wanted the NHS, all these sorts of things, right? It was like, thanks very much. You're the wartime president, the wartime prime minister. Goodbye. Now we want something different. I feel like that's my only comparable. And I don't really think that's particularly comparable to what's going on now. And maybe it will be, maybe it won't be. I don't know. So it's another unknown on top of all the other normal intra election unknowns. To what extent will this stuff be important? Does anybody care about what Keir Starmer's policy is on building homes that he may or may not announce in a year's time or something, right? Is anybody listening? I think that a lot of people aren't listening at the moment, but they certainly will be listening at some point between now and then. And I think public opinion is really important because I'm not sure what else we've got, right? What else do we have?
I take the point about how the 1945 election result really shows that switch from what do we want during wartime to what do we want post-wartime, and therefore people could both think that Churchill had been a good war leader and they didn't want him to still be prime minister. Although, in fairness to your predecessors as pollsters, I guess I should point out that if you look at the Gallup polls that were carried out in sort of 43, 44 and early 45, they had the Tories on, I'm just looking at the figures here, between 28 and 37%. So they consistently had the Tories at very clearly a losing vote share. And the mistake perhaps back then was people didn't pay enough attention to polls. There was a clue from the polls that got overlooked. But you mentioned that point about the impact they can have on the morale, even if there is this point that, yes, we know politics is likely to change to some extent before the next election, that an individual poll result or run of poll results can definitely impact morale here and now. So if you see a surprise poll result come out, if maybe one morning you hear that another pollster has got Labour up 5%, which at the time of recording would sound like quite out of kilter with other polls at the moment. What are the sorts of things you look for to think, is there something really up here, or nah, that's just a slightly weird result, or maybe something that we shouldn't expect to see reflected in our own next set of figures?
So a lot of polling results are very, very similar. So that's almost never happening these days. It's normally happening in a case where there's something new going on, where something strange is happening. So bigger changes are normally to do with other things that are not to do with, say, weighting, or it's often to do with the way that the questions have been constructed and asked. If you go back to the Alba example, there was a pollster that had a higher figure, and the way that they displayed Alba was more obvious. It was higher up. It was given more prominence than we would have normally. So I looked into that. Why they got Alba so high? They'd made them very prominent in the way that they'd asked the question. I think that probably affected some of the responses. It's not so changes or wacky results that they're normally to do with the way that questions have been asked. Is your normal kind of first stop. So you would need to go to the table to work that out. But yeah, I mean, I used to obsess more about these sorts of things, but I obsess less, apart from it if it's election time, and then I'll be looking a bit more closely.
And if it is election time, and maybe you're looking at one of a new poll that you're preparing, and you're looking at the data and it's out of kilter from what others are saying, is there anything in particular that you would then think to double check?
There's no sort of golden rule about the things that you use as weighting criteria. So sometimes which past votes are you weighting by? So there's not like necessarily a rule as to which ones you might need to use. If you take, for example, in constituency polling, one of the problems that we have when we're deciding like what are the results for a Hartlepool by-election poll, when we would normally weight the results by past vote, but we can see that from the way that we've done the poll, people are not remembering correctly. It doesn't look like they're remembering correctly how they voted in the past. So do we do that or not? So we might look at different ways of weighting the data, and in most cases we try to opt for the way we tend to have a bias towards using weighting methods that change the data the least from the raw data. So we're trying to not do too many weighting changes. So one of the things that we would always worry about is overweighting data. So you can say, well, I want it to be weighted in terms of all these different target criteria. If the effect of those weights is that you're changing the data a lot, and you set limits to the amount of which any response can be upweighted, so it doesn't become like a ridiculously large amount of your sample. But we look at the different ways that you might weight, and if the way that you're choosing to weight the data appears to be making lots of changes to the raw data, that's a sort of a question mark for us.
And presumably that means that there's a risk that, because your constituency polls have had quite a good run in by-elections, haven't they? But there's a risk, therefore, that one day you will, just by bad luck of sampling, get a sample that's rather off, and your parsimonious approach to weighting will not rectify that in a way that other pollsters who are more heavy-handed with their weighting, they have a different risk that they run, which is that a change in political circumstances or the like catches them out, and their weighting, pushes the figures off in a wrong direction because they're trying to weight to something that's now wrong. But I guess the risk for you is that every now and again there'll be a sample that's just off. Yes,
absolutely. And also on the phone, going back to constituency polls on the phone, it's very difficult to get a correct or balanced amount of young people to answer a survey within the time period. Getting contact data for people within a constituency is like an inverted pyramid. It's really easy to get the contact data for the older and older people but to try and get the correct balance and representation of 18 to 24s in a constituency poll is almost impossible. We've looked at combining like online and phone, but what we tend to normally do is just deal with the fact that we might have to only have 50% of the target that we're looking for amongst young people, and try and work out what to do with that. Do you weight them up to the correct target, knowing that you've only got a small and possibly unrepresentative number of them? It can be a bit of a judgment call.
Yeah. all plenty to keep everyone on their toes and arguing why the next poll that favours their party is accurate, or the next one that doesn't favour their party must therefore be inaccurate. But if people are interested in delving into learning a bit more about political polling and so on, is there anything you'd particularly recommend, other than obviously following both of us on Twitter? But is there any reading or podcast recommendations you'd particularly give?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, is the first thing I would say, because reading or listening too much about polling when that's something that you do all day for me it's a real busman's holiday. I think a couple of so apart from this podcast, which of course you're having people like me on, so
excellent recommendation.
That's obviously a very good start. I find he doesn't blog very often, but I find Anthony Wells pretty good.
Yeah.
Always have. He gets in some slight digs because he does work for YouGov about the unreliability of telephone polls or that sort of thing. But UK Polling Report is very good because he does a good job of being neutral. He does comment on things like house effects, which you've mentioned before. There's a huge back catalogue on UK Polling Report of bad things that pollsters do. So like the bad behaviour of polling, the types of questions that drive him mad. I sometimes use his rant about agree disagree questions as kind of internal training. So say, look, you say you really like internal agree disagree questions. Well, read this blog by Anthony Wells where you can feel him banging the table about acquiescence bias and calling out statements that sound reasonable and then asking if you agree, disagree with them and saying, well, yeah. So there's a really good back catalogue on UK Polling Report about things like bad polling questions. The bad polling questions is probably the number one thing that will see you right when you're looking around and deciding what you think about polls. Because if someone's majoring on an agree, disagree question about, say, strong leadership, does the UK want a strong leader as prime minister? If that's the statement and it's written in an agree disagree form, there's lots of reason to think that that's a really bad way to work out whether that does mean that the UK would like strong leadership from their prime minister.
Yeah, it's a really good blog post, that, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. I've read it closely myself a few times. So
yes, it's very good. It's very good. And then the other person I'd probably hold up on that, and he does have a podcast. It's a bit irregular. Would be Kieran Pedley. So Kieran was kind of out of political polling for a while because he was working for GFK and wasn't doing any political polling. Probably made him pretty bored because he likes political polling. So to sort of keep himself going, he was doing this Polling Matters podcast and doing a kind of neutral aspect on polling. Now he's polling again. He's now doing a bit of that for Ipsos, and I think that again, it's someone who's been around at least feels like about 10 years, a bit like me. They've seen a few elections, they've made some mistakes, they've got a bit of experience, and so they tend not to get overly excited about things. There's always sort of a sense of perspective. So I feel like Kieran normally says sort of sensible, measured things, and it's one of the few podcasts where they talk about methodology and have a bit of critical thinking about it. There's not an awful lot of that, which is really good.
Yeah, and I think Kieran does nicely balance that, most of the time talking about how you shouldn't pay too much attention to any one poll. And then, of course, when his employer has a new poll out, he has to diligently plug that. But I think he does segue that tension between business model pushing everyone towards getting overexcited about one poll, whilst remembering really the understanding comes from looking at more than one poll.
Yeah, so, and if I could just add one more, I find that when John Curtis is writing about polling methodology in Scotland, for example, it's usually a really worthwhile listening to, especially, for example, so he's quite good at taking down pollsters in terms of, again, like bad question construction. And an example would be putting independence in a list of priorities for Scots in an attempt to sort of say that independence isn't actually very important politically in Scotland, because we can construct this sort of importance of issues list we can find it at number 5 and say, well, look, these 4 things are much more important than independence. Why do the SNP bang on about independence so much? Well, he's good at sort of skewering those types of polling tricks that pollsters can do. So yeah, probably those 3. But in terms of a resource, I think UK Polling Report's pretty good for having an opinion on most of the things that are good and bad in polling.
Yeah, and I'll include links to all of that in the show notes, including to the European polling roundups that John Curtis writes. I think is about every month or 2 months, which are, I think, one of the very few examples of somebody regularly looking at polling on an issue rather than on voting intention and doing a summary of what all the different pollsters say and what picture you can draw from that, which I think on the European issue is particularly important because question wording can massively alter the results you get. So having a considered and methodologically well-informed roundup is really useful. If any other academics are listening, please somebody steal the John Curtis model and apply it to other policy areas as well. It would be great to have that. If there was as well-informed regular roundups about polling on, say, housing, that would become a must-read for political geeks very quickly, I'm sure. But thank you so much for that, Damian. That's been absolutely fascinating. Listeners who want to hear more from Damian can find him on Twitter at Damian Survation, myself at Mark Pack, and this podcast at Bar Chart Podcast. And do look out in the show notes for follow-up links that I've mentioned. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast and give it a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. Thank you, everyone, for listening.